I greet you in the midst of a most distressing time for our nation and for the church in the nation for obvious reasons. In the Christian church in America, because the gospel has been so perverted and so degraded that it's indistinguishable from the empire denounced by Jesus. American Christianity is empire. This is not an exaggeration or a rhetorical flourish, but a literal description of the top priorities, values, and activities of the current regime. As the poet Yeats wrote in his poem, The Second Coming, which he wrote in the early 20th century, and these might be familiar lines to you, things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Another prophet, but a literary one. There is no center. There's no consensus. This is by design, of course, as chaos among us commoners has always suited the powers that be. So, as I imagine many of you do, I look for points of common humanity, and I cling to any evidence that it exists. Most recently, such as when people across the ideological divide can care together and grieve together the loss of children swept out of camp cabins and into a swollen, deadly river. But even in this case, you might have noticed, some have either openly cheered or rolled their eyes, saying, "You reap what you sow. You voted against your own interests." Okay, yeah, that's true. That is true. But when and how is this best said? Or said at all? What does Lady Wisdom recommend? We can rightfully say such things, but it does matter how we do. Are we in a spirit of lamentation when we say such things, or are we in a spirit of gotcha? If we are in the spirit of gotcha, if we catch ourselves gloating, Jesus might want to have a word with us. Maybe a few words, like, lead us not into temptation, kids. How do we resist being hardened and numbed by the callousness of the wider society and still maintain the wit and the will to fight, as surely we are called to fight the good fight? I'm truly glad to be with you all this morning from Route 16 in the immigrant-rich city of Lynn, Massachusetts, where I've been living while serving a UU congregation since 2013. So therefore, I've served them through the first Trump administration, a pandemic, and now the second coming of the Trumpian mayhem. Last weekend, I happened to join with you because my friend Bridget Saunders invited me. Bridget and I met while doing a recent production of the musical Little Women. I was her Aunt March, and she played the tragic Sister Beth. It was the first time in ages where I got to be a worshiper and not be obliged to have anything to say to a congregation, but I just was able to receive the ministry of song, word, and table, and I thank you for welcoming me. It heartened me greatly to be with church folk who spoke openly about the turmoil and ravages of the current regime, to be among those who understand that there is no separation between political and religious, because both are an expression of moral values. And the church is exactly the right place where we faithfully confront our reality and discern together how to best cope with it from a moral place, individually and collectively. There have been many moments of late that I have found myself speechless with disbelief and rage. sputtering, How could, why don't they, what in the world is happening? And I'm not even finishing the sentence. This isn't okay. This isn't, but it is. That's the thing, it is. I remember the morning of 9/11, 2001. And my mother called me, my late mother called me. I was in bed reading at the time. And she started talking to me, and I clearly didn't know what she was talking about. And she said, honey, take the phone and go to the television right now. And we watched together as the second plane flew into the World Trade Center. In that moment, I experienced the same shock and horror that I'm currently experiencing a lot of the time. The same stammering disbelief. And believe it or not, and this is going to sound really super pious, but it's true, I grabbed my Bible. I tend to do this when I have no words, but I know that whatever's happening has probably already happened in human history. And I know that the Bible is a record of family photo album, of almost all of it. I don't know what to think or say, but I know that someone once upon a time tried to. And so I call upon them. I call myself into their company as they have invited me to be in theirs from thousands of years ago. I take them up on that invitation to abide with them in what is happening in the world and what God might be doing in that world. On that day, I happened to turn to the Psalms, which are so good at expressing shock and begging God, do something. These recent days, though, I find myself turning to the prophet Amos. I actually like him a lot. He's not fun. He's not a poet. He's not a mystic with gorgeous visions. He's a yeller. His nickname is actually the Prophet of Doom, and Tom is such a nice person that when he read it with such a nice measured tone, but I always think of Amos just yelling, I despise your festivals, I hate them, they stink. If he lived in our place and time, he would have cussed a lot. So a bit of context, Amos was a Judean shepherd who lived about 750 years BCE in the southern kingdom. There were two kingdoms of Israel at this time, and you don't need to worry about that. But Amos went from his home in Samaria to preach and rail against the prosperous northern kingdom. And when he did so, in doing so, he laid out one of the most powerful condemnations of a society's leaders that has ever been recorded and passed down for posterity. It's the diss track of all diss tracks. And the more blazing because, of course, in the tradition of the ancient Hebrew prophets, Amos claims to be speaking for God. He's one of those divinely inspired or maybe psychiatric case guys. It really depends what you think. So, channeling God, Amos rips his listeners apart for being comfortable while others suffer, for causing poverty and ignoring the poor, for playing at righteousness by holding religious rituals and festivities, parades maybe, all of which God says he hates and despises. I love that. I love that word stench. And at the end of this tirade, Amos says, again, channeling God, let justice roll down like the waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. And in our translation that we just had this morning, like a never-failing stream, which is really nice, a never-failing stream. You've probably heard the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. repeat these words. They are among the Hebrew Scripture's greatest hits and are truly beautiful. We would all desire this rolling of justice. But let's notice that Amos speaking for God, never explains where the justice is rolling down from. He has a lot more to say for another 5 chapters, in fact, but he never explains. In fact, what he does go on to do in the next 5 chapters of that particular book, he threatens more punishment and destruction. You know, it's very on brand for him. But here it is. It's easy to miss. The justice is flowing, and we are not to interrupt or impede it. God says, let it. God doesn't say, create it, form a committee to decide how to define it, take surveys to see what everyone thinks it should look like. I've already told you, says God. I've already made it abundantly clear. It's laid out in all of the commandments. It's laid out for us in the Christian tradition, in the Christian scriptures, in the Gospels. Don't get in its way. In spiritual direction, we speak of blocks to someone's ability to discern the movement of spirit in their lives. And we're all susceptible to blocks. Ego is the biggest one. Insecurity, projection, seeing the self as the center of the universe. In the collective, we see this played out on a massive and devastating scale with the accumulation of obscene wealth at the cost of exploiting the earth, animals, and human beings. I get my yachts and my billions and my cryogenic attempt at eternal life. So, the rest of you can rot in prisons and concentration camps, the victims of my fear, hatred, and ignorance. That's the block of all blocks. I harbor no fantasies that the architects of empire are going to have changes of heart or conversion experiences. They might, that's up to God. It's not surprising to me that Superman is currently the #1 hit at the box office, as we need superhero stories, even as we realize that we're going to have to be the ones to put the red cape on our backs and do it for ourselves and for each other. And we're going to have to call on our own superpowers of love and compassion and empathy. We must remember that if we are to respect and believe Amos's utterance, we can maintain faith that however interrupted, blocked, or insulted justice is also an aspect or quality of the ground of being itself. It has what we call an ontological reality. It is an element of that in which we live and move and have our being. I cling to that. So I urge all of us to wake up every day and orient ourselves to that reality. Pray towards it. Be creatively engaged with that flowing justice and righteousness, and make it our job to unblock it wherever possible. Domestic terrorists are kidnapping your neighbors as they are mine. Unblock the fear and get around, knock on doors. Try out your really beginner level Spanish. Ask who needs what. Join with your local grassroots organizations who have been doing this kind of thing. We don't have to start it all from scratch. Who needs what? Food? Yeah, we can do that. A ride to an immigration hearing or to a detention center, a letter, a phone call? Yes, we can do that. We can unblock where someone has erected an edifice of pain and despair. The earth is burning. Damage is irrevocable. Okay, yeah. We will do what we can to unblock cynicism and inaction. There are a million ways to do that. You already know so many of them. And when you do that, you are helping that stream, that never-failing stream, to flow. I said earlier that the center does not hold. I was quoting Yeats, that we have no consensus. This may be true, but for the time being, we can remain as centered as possible in what we know does still hold, holding to the prophetic vision of care and concern for all, of decency, and even with anger, keeping our souls open and alive to the holy justice and righteousness that we have been assured eternally and ceaselessly flows and fills and uplifts wherever it can. May we be channels for that stream.